Okay, time now for our debate segment, and today we're going to look at whether or not the US move to reimpose sanctions on Iran will do more harm or good for the economy and security worldwide. US President Donald Trump pulled out of the long-negotiated 2015 nuclear deal in May, and sanctions are to be reimposed in the coming hours. So will they motivate Tehran to make more moves to reduce nuclear activities and prove it is doing such, or will it prompt Iran to also leave the agreement and go back to enriching uranium? And what does it mean for the livelihoods of Iranians, first of all, but also the wider global economy? Well, standing by in the US to give us their views are Behnam Taleblu, a research fellow at the Foundation of Defense and Democracies. Also from Washington, we'll hopefully be joined by senior policy fellows at Johns Hopkins University, Mr. Abbas Kadim. But before we get dug in with our guest, Duca Royer reminds us of what exactly this first round of sanctions will bring.
A brand new ATR plane lands in Urmia, northwestern Iran. 5 of this European model arrived over the weekend, meaning Iran has received 13 of the 20 it ordered from the French-Italian manufacturer last year. This just before US sanctions snap back into effect, cutting off sales of US and European aircraft. The punitive measures being reimposed this week also cover Iranian trade in the US dollar, real transactions outside Iran, and trade in automobiles and metals, including gold. US imports of Iranian products such as carpets and pistachios are banned. More significant sanctions targeting Iran's oil sector and central bank are set to be restored in November. It's a unilateral move by Washington, but with worldwide consequences. A ban on Iran's dealings in the US dollar, as well as on trading in the Iranian currency outside it, would make it next to impossible for any foreign firms to do business with Tehran. European companies like Danish shipping giant Maersk and German insurer Allianz are winding down their business in Iran. Automakers are divided. While Peugeot PSA is suspending its activities there, Renault, Daimler and Volkswagen are planning to keep them up. The prospect of US sanctions have caused a run on the Iranian currency. The rial has lost half of its value since April. The Iranian authorities are reversing an earlier decision to restrict foreign currency transactions to try and halt the rial's collapse.
Well, let's cross first to our first guest, Mr. Behnam Taleblu, research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Mr. Taleblu, thanks so much for joining us live from Washington. Firstly, can I get your opinion on this decision by the US, firstly to withdraw from the nuclear deal and reimpose these sanctions? Good move, bad move?
Well, thanks for having me. I think it was not the wisest move, but it was a move that was a long time coming. I myself am a vociferous critic of the Iran nuclear deal. I would not have left the deal in this fashion, but nonetheless, it's no use crying over spilt milk. But I do defend very vigorously, in fact, the move to heavily reimpose sanctions divided in 2 phases, one on August 6 and one on November 4. And I fully support, furthermore, their enforcement by the US through secondary sanctions.
And do you believe that economic sanctions will, prompt Iran to come back to the negotiating table, as we're now hearing Donald Trump would like again to sign a new deal? Won't this just anger them?
Well, the Iranians have been angry before the deal, during the deal, after the deal, and angst and anger among the Iranian ruling elite is not primarily my concern or that of the U.S. administration. That being said, there are only a select few times in the history of the Islamic Republic where its leadership and elites have done an about-face on key security issues. One is ending the Iran-Iraq war. Another is restraining their nuclear program after the Iraq war of 2003. And another was coming to the negotiating table in 2012-13, and then moving to ink the interim deal and then the final deal in 2015. Iran, in all cases, negotiated under massive pressure, massive foreign pressure. And why I support the resurrection, reimposition, and reinforcement of the sanctions is to, again, resurrect that massive pressure.
Because if you're sitting in Tehran today, would you believe that the US actually wants any new deal signed with Tehran? Is that just said for good form? But do you think Washington wants to go back to the negotiating table and find a new agreement?
Yes, but I would also be aware that Washington will not be limited to a nuclear agreement. I think the point of reinstating all this pressure and under this shorter time frame and under such duress is to actually get a more comprehensive agreement, which is not to replicate some of the flaws of the JCPOA nuclear deal, but to read in the regional issue, basically Iran's proxies, terrorist forces in the region, and perhaps most importantly, the ballistic missile issue, which was needlessly divorced in negotiations in 2014 from the debate over the future of the nuclear deal. So if I'm Tehran, I'm seeing Washington adopt a high-risk, high-reward sanctions implementation strategy, and 2019 will really be the year of decision for these penalties to take effect, and we'll see to what degree, if any, they can begin to change the Iranian calculus. But what cannot be doubted is the degree to which they are changing the Iranian economy.
And we will look very, very soon at that Iranian economy. But how do you think Iran might react to these new sanctions? You know, we're hearing reports that they did send some Navy ships into the Strait of Hormuz, that they might try and block oil tankers. How harsh a response do you think they can give?
Well, it's very important if you're a Western government, particularly the United States right now, to be able to red team or analyze your adversary's best moves. Iran's play right now, despite some of the moves in the Strait of Hormuz, is primarily diplomatic. Iran is looking to cleave the transatlantic community apart and sic the Europeans on the U.S. and basically create a situation where the European Union, which is America's major trading, economic, security, political, and even intelligence partner, is willing to side publicly with the Islamic Republic of Iran, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, in a bid to bypass U.S. sanctions. And so they're looking to create optics associated with that move. That being said, major European banks and businesses are leaving Iran, and those political optics are not yielding dividends. So Iran is looking to escalate on multiple fronts. The Persian Gulf could be one. Less likely, of course, is through their proxies in Syria and Iraq. There's also a return to ballistic missile flight testing. That's an option Tehran has. We've gone a year now without a single Iranian ballistic missile being fired. From the day the nuclear deal was inked until, I think, present, there have been 23 ballistic missile launches. And since President Trump came into office, that number has decreased significantly.
So some moves there on the Iranian side of things. Well, let's look at that economic issue. And when this nuclear deal was signed back in 2015, hopes were high that it would herald a new era of economic boom in Iran. That didn't exactly happen, and now things are set to go somewhat in the opposite direction. Here's a quick listen to some Iranians who are already feeling the pinch and what they think about it.
We've never experienced such a dramatic situation before. Prices are going up at a dizzying rate. Workers don't know if they'll keep their jobs. Renters can't extend the leases on their houses.
Why aren't we negotiating with the Americans? We didn't elect the government to live through difficulties like this.
If the government takes up the fight against corruption and punishes those who manipulate the markets and the people's earning power, and put people in charge based on competence, not favoritism, things will improve and we can stand up to the sanctions.
Well, let me bring in now our other guest, Abbas Kazim, Senior Policy Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University. Mr. Kazim, thanks so much for your time also. Let me start with yourself just on that economic question. How bad do you think, these sanctions could affect Iranian daily life? And do you think that they're an effective way of getting Iran to enter further negotiations?
Well, that's what sanctions do. They make the lives of the population miserable. They rarely do anything to the government from the negative side. That's how the history is, because the understanding here is that when you put the pressure on a country through sanctions, the government will start thinking about what the sentiment of the population will do and how it will develop, and then the government will respond favorably to the sanctions. The thing is, one presupposition of this is missing, is that governments do care about the sentiments of the population. In countries where there aren't really much sentiments, influences on the government, that does not work. There is a missing piece here that sometimes sanctions don't account for, and that's why the sanctions against Iraq didn't work. the sanctions.
However,
against
Mr.
Cuba didn't
Kadim, when
work.
we look at
No
Iran, people are out on the streets protesting about the dire economic situation, protesting even in the sound bites we just heard, the vox pops from the people in Iran saying, why isn't our government negotiating with America? We want action, we want more than this. So it is having, the people in Iran are having their voice heard, are they not? And could this not put those in power in Iran under increasing pressure? It looks like we have lost our connection to Mr. Kadim there in Washington. So let me bring back in our other guest, Mr. Behnam Taleblu. Mr. Taleblu, I hope you could hear our conversation and questions there. But I was just, listening to the people in Tehran and the fact that they wanted their leaders to go and negotiate with America, demanding more. Does these sanctions put really very strict pressure on the regime and possibly put it in jeopardy, possibly be aiming to bring it down? Is that what Washington is ultimately looking for?
You know, there's a robust debate in Washington among the analytical community over what is the true goal or the perceived goal of the sanctions. But if you take the administration's official line, which is to force a significant change in behavior, that's what the sanctions really do seem to be aimed at. It's supposed to drive the regime to a choice, a narrowing tree of options, where either Iran is able to maintain its malign activities at home and in the region on the nuclear file, or instead to have a functioning economy and be reintegrated into the international system. The challenge is, of course, revolutionary Iran has always preferred to be more revolutionary than Iranian. And to read in some of the comments by the guest that you mentioned, yes, in the academic literature, that is an undistributed middle, meaning that, authoritarian states tend to care a little bit less about the sentiments of their population. But because authoritarian states don't have democratic institutions, when their population does tend to care about something, they pour into the streets. And then that becomes a threat to regime security. And then if you factor in the 30, almost 40-year split between state and society in Iran, the regime elites do really need to care about what the street is saying. Because what we've seen since December 2017 is protests not by Tehranis who have blue jeans, cooler and better looking than you and I per se, but it's by the regime's social base, the urban and rural poor, the religious, the downtrodden, the dispossessed, the people that Khomeini made the revolution for. And so in many ways, the sanctions from foreign sanctions pressure and domestic popular pressure could kind of put the regime into a pincer and force them towards that choice.
And Mr. Taleblu, where do you think that this leaves that 2015, the long negotiated nuclear agreement? The other signatories to that deal, the EU, Russia, all of them want to keep that afloat. Do you think that's possible? Do you think Iran will be motivated to see it? Or if the US is gone, does that really put it in the water?
I do see the fate of the JCPOA nuclear deal, the 2015 deal, to be quite dim here and getting dimmer each day. It is quite apparent that banks and businesses are more inclined to side with Washington as opposed to Brussels or Tehran when it comes to the interpretation of what will come after sanctions and is Iran a friendly place for business, and is it worth going along with European schemes to create various investment fronts to keep the deal alive with Iran. That appears quite clear to me. The question really is the ball is in Iran's court here. If Iran is looking to escalate and respond to these sanctions, will it more overtly transgress the letter of the nuclear deal? That's an open question. I don't think that's a question Iranian decision makers will entertain until after November 4, when the heaviest sanctions, the oil sanctions, will be levied and then will kick in. Because once Iran does that, I think it's more likely the Europeans will be driven towards the American position. And I think the Iranians realize that.
Because if we go back to the 2015 deal being scrapped completely, surely that's a negative. All these countries sat down for many years to put something on paper. Iran had signed up to stopping, a lot of its nuclear activities. Surely that was a good thing.
I mean, it was a good thing if you believe the interpretation of some of the key diplomats of the agreement. Having read the agreement multiple times, the agreement actually didn't solve the nuclear problem with Iran. It was a sophisticated time-buying mechanism. It wasn't really even an arms control deal. Even according to proponents of the deal, those who helped negotiate it, like Jake Sullivan of the Obama administration, I believe he didn't even call it an agreement. He called it a plan of action, hence the name, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It had very little legal weight internationally and at home, especially in the two key countries where it has been most contentious, in the United States and in Iran. So I understand the European concern. The European Union always says it took more than a decade of negotiations to get this. I understand their interest in saving this is not just commercial, but it's also purposes of pride, purposes of national security. But there is a fundamental disagreement between Washington and Brussels over what to do next.
Indeed, and we're hearing from Brussels that it's going to put in place, as of Tuesday, I believe, a blocking statute that actually forbids EU companies complying with these US sanctions and offering compensation if their business is affected. Could we really see a huge escalation in tensions then between the EU and the US also over this?
I think we're seeing an escalation on the political file, but nothing substantive. You know, it's worth tracking the debate over the blocking legislation in the European Council. But in the end of the day, banks and businesses continue to side with Washington over Tehran and over Brussels. And what that means is that they are refusing not necessarily the legal predicate of the blocking legislation, but the net effect, the net effect is to prevent compliance with American secondary sanctions. These banks and businesses either transact in US dollars or do transactions that touch the US financial system, or bank in the United States, or have clients in the United States, and see protecting those investments, those assets, those transactions as being much more worthwhile and beneficial to their bottom lines. And it's even gotten to the point where you see select European countries, such as France, come out and say something perfunctory in terms of supporting the blocking legislation move, but then undercutting that support by saying, well, no one can really compel a company to do something that's against their interests.
Okay, Mr. Taleblu, we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. But thank you so much for giving us your analysis of that situation as the US looks to reimpose those sanctions against Iran. And indeed, as we were speaking, I'm just seeing a newswire fall there saying the Iranian President Rouhani has also been speaking. He says the US cannot be trusted now. So, of course, this debate could go on for a lot longer. But we're going to have to leave it there. That brings us to the end of this edition.